December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. The frozen earth of the Ardennes forest lay wrapped in pre-dawn silence. Obergefreiter Klaus Neumann of the 2nd SS Panzer Division crouched in his foxhole, breath misting in the bitter cold. For 3 days, the Americans had been eerily quiet, too quiet. The sudden calm after months of relentless shelling felt unnatural, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Then it began. A single whistle split the air, one shell, then another. Within heartbeats, a dozen more. And then the sky simply tore apart. In the first 90 seconds, over 800 shells struck German positions along a 5-kilometer front. That is nearly 9 shells every single second. The ground convulsed as if the earth itself were dying. Trees splintered into toothpicks. Foxholes collapsed. Men screamed, but their voices were swallowed by the roar. Klaus Neumann would later write in his diary, if he survived to write anything at all, that he had experienced Soviet artillery at Kursk, British bombardments at Caen, but what the Americans unleashed that morning defied comprehension. This was not artillery fire. This was annihilation delivered with industrial precision. This is the story of how the Wehrmacht discovered far too late that American artillery had evolved beyond anything German military doctrine could imagine. A system so devastating, so mathematically precise, that it changed the very nature of warfare itself. The Germans called it the American miracle. The Americans simply called it time on target. To understand the shock that German soldiers experienced when they first encountered the full fury of American artillery, you must step back to 1942. North Africa, the desert heat shimmering over blood-soaked sand. Feldwebel Ernst Hoffmann of the 15th Panzer Division, Africa Corps, had been fighting in the desert for 18 months. He knew British tactics intimately. Long artillery preparations, methodical and predictable. The British would shell for hours, giving the Germans time to take cover, wait it out, then counterattack when the barrage lifted. On October 23rd, 1942, near El Alamein, everything changed. American units had just arrived. The 1st Infantry Division, which the British called the Big Red One. That afternoon, at 14:30 hours, the barrage began. But it was different, surgically different. In the first 15 minutes, American batteries fired over 3,000 shells. That was triple what the British typically expended in an entire hour. But the volume was not the terrifying part. The shells followed a pattern. First, observation posts were obliterated. Then, command centers. Then, communication lines. Each strike was deliberate, calculated, methodical. Hoffmann counted the impacts from his dugout. After 20 minutes, he lost count. After 30 minutes, the earth beneath him began to crack. After 40 minutes, he understood with cold clarity that this was not random shelling. This was systematic destruction. The Americans were employing a revolutionary technique they called time on target. Every battery calculated the precise flight time of their shells. Then, at a designated moment, all guns fired simultaneously so that every single shell, regardless of distance or trajectory, landed on the target at exactly the same instant. The effect was catastrophic. There was no warning whistle, no time to dive for cover. 1 second, silence. The next second, complete devastation. That day, Hoffmann lost half his company before they even saw an American infantryman. But this was only the beginning. The Americans were just warming up their machine. The secret of American artillery supremacy did not lie solely in the guns themselves, though the weapons were formidable. The true revolution was organizational, intellectual, mathematical. While German artillery relied on time-tested methods from the previous war, American engineers and mathematicians were rewriting the rules entirely. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in 1941, before the United States had even entered the war, a group of artillery officers, mathematicians and engineers worked under Colonel Orlando Ward. Their mission sounded deceptively simple: make American artillery the most accurate and responsive in the world. Ward understood that modern warfare had changed. The static trenches of the First World War were gone. Battles were now mobile. Targets moved. There was no time for the elaborate calculations that had characterized artillery operations in 1918. Ward's team created something revolutionary: graphical firing tables. Previously, artillery crews used complex mathematical formulas to calculate trajectories, a process requiring 10 to 15 minutes per target. The American firing tables produced the same result in 30 seconds. But that was only half the innovation. The other half was standardization. The Americans developed a unified coordinate system usable across every theater of war. Every point on every map had a 6-digit code. Every target type had its classification number. Every shell type had its designation. The result was elegant in its simplicity. An American forward observer could call in devastating fire with a single transmission. Fire mission: grid 892347. Enemy infantry, high explosive, fire for effect. Within 2 to 3 minutes, shells were raining down on the target. By comparison, German artillery crews needed 15 to 20 minutes to gather coordinates, verify them through multiple channels, calculate firing solutions, and transmit orders to the gun crews. The Americans had also revolutionized the method of fire adjustment. Traditionally, artillery fired a single, ranging shot, observed where it landed, made corrections, and fired again. This process could consume precious hours. The Americans invented the bracket method. They fired 4 spotting shells simultaneously, 1 at the calculated center point and 3 around it in a triangular pattern. The forward observer simply selected whichever shell landed closest to the target and radioed minor corrections. The entire process, from target acquisition to destruction, took 3 to 4 minutes, 5 to 6 times faster than any other army in the world. March 14th, 1944. Italy, near the town of Cassino. American Lieutenant James O'Brien of the 34th Infantry Division crawled through the rubble of an ancient monastery. In his hands, he carried an SCR 610 radio, weight 15 kilograms, range 25 kilometers. O'Brien was a forward observer, the critical link between the infantry and the guns. Through his radio, O'Brien did not speak to a single battery. He contacted the division's Fire Direction Center. There sat Captain William Schmidt, a former accountant from Chicago who, before the war, had never seen an artillery piece except in newsreels. But Schmidt possessed something far more powerful than battlefield experience. He had firing tables calculated with mechanical computing devices. He had detailed maps with coordinates for every landmark. And he had the ability to coordinate the simultaneous fire of 48 guns. "Observer requesting fire," O'Brien spoke into the radio. "Grid coordinates 892347. German infantry entrenched. Request immediate fire for effect." Schmidt studied his map. He pressed the transmit button. "All batteries, target number 47. Hits and grid 892347. High explosive. Point, detonating fuse. Range 8,200 meters. Elevation 312 mils. Full charge, 1 round each battery. Time on target 14:23:30. Execute." What happened next, the Germans would call an American miracle. Within 45 seconds, 48 shells struck the German position simultaneously, and not 1 second earlier, not 1 second later. Every shell arriving at precisely the same instant. The psychological effect equaled the physical devastation. German soldiers were accustomed to artillery barrages that started gradually. A single ranging shot, then corrections, then a few more shells, building slowly to mass fire. They had time to recognize the pattern and dive for cover. The American time-on-target system eliminated that luxury. The first shell was also the last warning. There was no escalation, only sudden, overwhelming death delivered from the sky. The secret lay in radio communication and centralized fire control. Every American division possessed its own fire direction center equipped with the latest radio equipment. Operators could coordinate all divisional artillery simultaneously, bringing dozens of guns to bear on a single target within minutes. Even more impressively, the Americans had created a system of interdivisional cooperation. If a situation demanded overwhelming firepower, fire direction centers from multiple divisions could combine their efforts, massing hundreds of guns on a single objective. On June 9, 1944, during the Normandy invasion, the Americans demonstrated the most stunning example of this coordination. 1,296 guns from 7 divisions opened fire simultaneously on German coastal positions. In the first 20 minutes, they fired 18,000 shells. That is 15 shells every single second, sustained for 20 uninterrupted minutes. German soldier Wilfried Scholz of the 352nd Infantry Division, who somehow survived that barrage, later recalled, "It felt as if the sky itself had shattered and was falling upon us. The noise was so immense that blood ran from my ears. The earth leapt like a living creature. I genuinely believed the world was ending." But the Americans possessed another advantage beyond coordination and speed. They had created ammunition with revolutionary capabilities. While German shells relied on traditional explosives and design principles, American engineers had achieved breakthroughs in metallurgy and chemistry that multiplied the destructive power of each round. At DuPont Laboratories in Delaware, chemists had perfected Composition B, an explosive mixture containing approximately 60% RDX and 40% TNT. This compound possessed roughly 50% greater explosive power than conventional TNT and remained stable even under high-velocity impacts. American shells were also fitted with the M51 fuse, which could function either instantaneously upon contact or with a programmed delay. This meant a shell could penetrate the outer layer of a concrete bunker and detonate inside the structure, whereas typical German ordnance detonated on contact with the surface, creating mostly shallow exterior damage. The most devastating innovation, however, was the proximity fuse. Developed in absolute secrecy, these fuses used miniature radar systems to detonate shells at a preset height above the ground, typically 5 to 10 meters. The result was an airburst that rained shrapnel downward at a 45-degree angle, reaching men hiding in trenches and foxholes. Traditional artillery fire could be evaded by taking cover. Proximity-fused shells made cover nearly useless. The Germans called these weapons the rain of death. Part 2. To grasp the true magnitude of American artillery dominance, one must understand the industrial colossus that supported it. While German factories struggled under Allied bombing and resource shortages, American industry operated at a scale the Wehrmacht could scarcely imagine. During the war, United States factories produced approximately 41 million artillery shells and rounds of various calibers. That staggering figure meant that, on average, American industry turned out more than 28,000 artillery shells every single day for nearly 4 years. At peak production in 1942 and 43, that figure reached over 50,000 shells per day, one shell every 2 seconds, around the clock, for months on end. The Chrysler plant in Warren, Michigan, exemplified this transformation. Before the war, it assembled Plymouth automobiles. By 1943, it had been completely converted to producing tanks and artillery pieces. The main production line stretched 1.8 kilometers. At one end, raw steel sheets. At the other, finished M101 105mm howitzers. Production time for a single gun, 8 hours and 20 minutes. But shell production was only part of the equation. The Americans had also revolutionized explosives. At DuPont's facilities in Delaware, chemists worked around the clock, producing the new Composition B explosive. By mid-1944, American plants manufactured over 10,000 tons of high-explosive compounds per month. This was more than Germany could produce in an entire year. The implications were stark. Practically every American shell could be filled with optimal explosive charges, while the German shells often contained inferior substitutes due to material shortages. The logistics system worked as an extension of the assembly line. Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels built at a rate of 3 per week, delivered ammunition directly to European theaters. Each ship could carry 10,000 tons of cargo, equivalent to approximately 65,000 rounds of 155mm shells. Onshore, the ammunition was loaded onto dedicated trains. The Americans constructed over 15,000 kilometers of new railway lines in Europe, specifically for artillery supply needs. Trains departed with clockwork precision. Every 20 minutes, another convoy rolled toward the front. The system functioned so efficiently that American artillery never, not once during the entire war, experienced critical ammunition shortages. Meanwhile, German gunners frequently operated under severe rationing. 10 to 15 shells per gun per day was typical. The contrast could not have been starker. An American artillery crew could fire at will, suppressing any target that appeared. A German crew had to count every precious round, calculating whether each shot justified the expenditure. The result was a fundamental asymmetry in how the two sides could employ artillery. For Americans, artillery became the primary weapon, the hammer that broke enemy resistance before infantry even advanced. For Germans, artillery became a carefully hoarded resource, used sparingly, reactively, always insufficient. July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra. The American breakout from Normandy. General Omar Bradley prepared the most concentrated artillery strike in military history up to that point. The objective: smash German defenses along a front only 7 kilometers wide, creating a breach for armored exploitation. 914 guns, ranging from 105 mm to 240 mm howitzers, were positioned and ready. 1,800 tons of shells had been stockpiled. The fire plan called for 60 minutes of uninterrupted bombardment. But the truly revolutionary aspect was the precision. Each gun crew knew its exact sector. Each shell had its designated target. This was not area bombardment. This was surgical destruction, executed with industrial efficiency. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The results exceeded all expectations. In 1 hour, German forces lost approximately 70% of their personnel and equipment in the breakthrough zone. More importantly, they lost the organizational capacity to resist. Soldiers abandoned their weapons and fled. Communication networks collapsed. Command structures disintegrated. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, which bore the brunt of the attack, later wrote, "My division was literally ground into the earth. I lost 70 tanks without firing a single shot in return. This was not battle. This was industrial slaughter." The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical destruction. German veterans, hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front, discovered that nothing in their experience had prepared them for the sheer volume and accuracy of American fire. Soviet artillery, while numerous, lacked the coordination and precision of American systems. British artillery, while competent, could not match American rates of fire and ammunition availability. But American artillery possessed one weapon that the Germans dreaded above all others: the proximity fuse. Developed in absolute secrecy and deployed only in late 1944, these revolutionary fuses contained miniature radar systems that detonated shells at a preset altitude, typically 5 to 10 meters above the ground. The effect transformed artillery warfare. Traditional shells detonated on impact with the ground or upon striking an object. Soldiers could evade them by diving into trenches or foxholes. Proximity-fused shells eliminated that protection. They exploded overhead, raining shrapnel downward at a 45-degree angle that reached into trenches, foxholes, and behind cover. The Germans called it the rain of death. General George S. Patton, never one for understatement, declared the proximity fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. While perhaps an exaggeration, the statement reflected a fundamental truth. Against proximity-fused shells, German defensive tactics, developed over 5 years of war, became obsolete overnight. December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Hitler's last great gamble on the Western Front. The Battle of the Bulge. For the first 3 days, fortune favored the Germans. Dense fog grounded American aircraft. The surprise attack achieved breakthroughs along multiple sectors. For a brief moment, it seemed Hitler's desperate offensive might succeed. Then, on December 19th, the weather cleared. American artillery revealed its full, devastating power. General George S. Patton received orders to wheel his entire Third Army northward and strike the German flank. He had 48 hours to redeploy 133,000 men and 800 artillery pieces. Any other army would have required weeks. The Americans accomplished it in 36 hours. Patton commanded 432 guns of various calibers and, most crucially, unlimited ammunition. While his infantry and armor marched north, his artillery systematically destroyed German resistance before they arrived. On December 22nd, the Third Army struck the German 5th Panzer Army near Bastogne. The Germans expected a methodical, cautious assault. Instead, they were engulfed by an artillery hurricane that made their own 1940 barrage of France seem modest by comparison. All 432 guns opened fire simultaneously. In the first 30 minutes, they fired 12,000 shells. That is 400 shells per minute, nearly 7 shells every single second, sustained for half an hour. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper, described the experience. The earth became hell. Explosions everywhere, death everywhere. My tanks burned like candles. My soldiers went mad with terror. In 30 minutes, I lost half my command. The Americans employed a new tactic, the rolling barrage. Artillery fire moved across the battlefield like a mechanical steamroller, crushing everything in its path. First, the German front line was obliterated. Then, the fire shifted to the second defensive line. Then, the third. As the curtain of explosions advanced, American infantry and tanks followed immediately behind, assaulting positions that had been shattered seconds earlier. The effect was devastating. German defenders barely had time to emerge from their holes before American armor was upon them. Resistance was sporadic, disorganized, and quickly overwhelmed. In just 8 hours, Patton's Third Army smashed through 15 kilometers of fortified German defenses. American casualties, 340 killed and wounded. German casualties, 8,000 killed, wounded, and captured, plus 150 tanks and assault guns destroyed. The disparity spoke for itself. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By late 1944, the psychological impact of American artillery on German morale had become a crisis for the Wehrmacht. Dr. Werner Scholz, a German military psychiatrist, studied soldiers in the autumn and winter of that year. His findings were alarming. 78% showed symptoms of what was then called war neurosis, today recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms included chronic insomnia, uncontrollable trembling, panic attacks, triggered by any loud noise, and complete loss of fighting spirit. Many soldiers dropped their weapons and surrendered the instant they heard incoming shells, without any attempt at resistance. The fear of American artillery had become more powerful than fear of their own military police. Sergeant Kurt Becker of the 276th Infantry Division recalled, "When the Americans started firing, I lost all control. My hands shook so violently I could not hold my rifle. I wished only for one thing, that it would stop. I did not care if we won or lost. I simply wanted to survive the next 5 minutes." The Americans quickly recognized the psychological power of their artillery and deliberately exploited it. They developed harassment fire, short, intense bursts at irregular, unpredictable intervals. The goal was not primarily to kill, but to prevent sleep, prevent rest, prevent any semblance of normal routine. Germans could never adapt because the intervals were randomized. They never knew when the next strike would come. The accumulated stress broke men psychologically before they ever faced infantry assault. January 14th, 1945. The 212th German Infantry Division in Alsace, at 6 in the morning, American guns, fired for 5 minutes, silence for 37 minutes, then 9 minutes of intensive fire, silence for 23 minutes. The pattern continued, random and unpredictable. Germans could not sleep, could not eat, could not even relieve themselves without terror. After 3 days of this calculated psychological warfare, 40% of the division was combat ineffective, not from casualties, but from nervous collapse. The divisional commander, Major General Hans von Obstfelder, begged higher headquarters for permission to withdraw his men from the line. But there was nowhere to withdraw to. Every sector faced the same overwhelming American firepower. Most psychologically destructive were the night barrages. At 2 or 3 in the morning, when human resistance is lowest, American artillery would suddenly erupt. Proximity-fused air-burst shells lit the sky with ghastly flashes. The distinctive screaming of incoming rounds terrorized exhausted men. Searchlights blinded and disoriented defenders who emerged from shelters. Egbert Schroeder, a veteran of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, later testified, "The night barrages were the absolute worst. You lay in your foxhole, hearing whistles, seeing flashes, and it felt as though you had descended into hell itself. Many comrades went insane. Some screamed uncontrollably and never stopped. The psychological collapse became so severe that entire units lost combat capability before American infantry even attacked. Soldiers deserted en masse or surrendered at the first opportunity. Combat effectiveness dissolved not through casualties, but through the complete shattering of will. The winter of 1944 to 1945 marked Germany's final, desperate attempt to reverse their fortunes. But American artillery had evolved into a force that made conventional military resistance nearly impossible. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. During the Battle of the Bulge, which lasted from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945, American forces fired approximately 1,255,000 artillery rounds. That figure represents shells from over 4,155 guns brought into action. The Germans, despite committing over 400,000 men and 2,600 artillery pieces to the offensive, managed to fire only about 1,200 shells per day after December 20th, when their initial ammunition stocks were depleted. The mathematics of attrition were merciless. American guns outnumbered German guns by ratios approaching 3 or 4 to 1. American ammunition stocks were, for practical purposes, unlimited. German shells were strictly rationed. The result was a grinding, one-sided artillery duel that the Wehrmacht could not possibly win. By February 1945, German defensive capabilities on the Western Front existed mostly on paper. Units surrendered before engaging, unwilling to face another American barrage. The collapse of morale became near universal. Officers reported that men would abandon positions at the first sound of incoming shells, long before actual danger materialized. The March crossing of the Rhine River showcased American artillery supremacy at its absolute peak. General Omar Bradley massed 1,347 artillery systems along the western bank. Stockpiles included approximately 2,800,000 shells of various calibers, more than the entire German army possessed on all fronts combined. At 5 o'clock on the morning of March 21st, the artillery preparation began. The bombardment could reportedly be heard in Paris, over 300 kilometers away. Seismographs at the University of Göttingen recorded ground tremors from the sustained explosions. For German defenders on the eastern bank, the experience defied description. Unterführer Hans Meyer of the 18th Parachute Regiment recalled, "The ground shook continuously for 3 hours. The air was nothing but dust and smoke. We could neither breathe nor communicate. I genuinely believed the world was ending." German defensive positions, constructed over 6 months, were obliterated. Heavy 280mm rounds pierced 2-meter-thick concrete bunkers. The 240 isometer shells collapsed entire underground command posts. Incendiary shells containing white phosphorus added chemical terror to explosive destruction, sealing bunkers with fire and toxic smoke that killed where fragments could not reach. German counter-battery fire proved utterly ineffective. American radar systems located enemy guns within seconds of their first shot. Fire direction centers assembled coordinated fire missions from dozens of batteries within minutes. Colonel Gerhard Engel, commander of the 27th Artillery Regiment, reported, "In 2 hours we lost 31 guns out of 36. The enemy destroys us with their first salvo. To continue firing is suicide." By the evening of March 21st, German defenses along the Rhine had effectively ceased to exist. Of 85,000 defenders, fewer than 20,000 remained capable of combat. The remainder were dead, wounded, captured, or had dissolved into the chaos of retreat. One day of American artillery had destroyed what took half a year to construct. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, the statistics painted an overwhelming picture. American artillery on the Western Front had fired approximately 27 million shells. Research indicates that artillery and mortar fire caused between 60 and 70% of all German casualties in the West. The numbers were devastating. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers killed, wounded, or psychologically shattered by American firepower. But the greatest achievement was not the destruction itself, it was the speed. Without overwhelming artillery superiority, the campaign in Western Europe might have dragged on another year, perhaps two. General Dwight Eisenhower later stated, "American artillery shortened this war by at least a year and saved hundreds of thousands of lives." The legacy extended far beyond 1945. The principles developed between 1941 and 1945 became the foundation of all modern artillery doctrine. Centralized fire control, computerized targeting, satellite navigation, all descend directly from wartime American innovations. Time on target remains the gold standard for coordinated fire missions. The proximity fuse evolved into modern airburst munitions. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant commanders, wrote in his memoirs, "American artillery changed warfare forever. They proved that in modern conflict, victory belongs not to the best soldiers, but to superior organization and industrial capacity. We did not lose on the battlefield. We lost in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh." The German soldier, Klaus Neumann, who survived that December morning in the Ardennes, later reflected, "We thought we were the world's finest army. We had beaten France, conquered most of Europe, fought the Soviets to a standstill, but against American artillery, none of that mattered. They simply had resources we could not match, coordination we could not replicate, and industrial power beyond imagination." The American artillery revolution demonstrated a fundamental truth that remains relevant today. Technological advantage, organizational efficiency, and industrial supremacy can overcome battlefield courage and tactical skill. The Wehrmacht discovered, too late, that courage alone cannot defeat an enemy who fires 10,000 shells in 60 seconds with mathematical precision. When those shells rained down in the Ardennes that frozen December morning, they did not merely destroy German positions, they shattered the last illusions of German military invincibility and announced the arrival of a new era in warfare. An era where science, industry, and systematic organization would dominate the battlefield more completely than heroism ever could. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.